Today we're going to walk through the install of an RPS triple in a MK4 Supra. It's one of my favorite go-to clutches for a street car that makes a lot of power, and I'm going to go through the steps on what it takes to install it. These clutches are going to come with new flywheel bolts, a new pilot bearing, Loctite, a new throwout bearing, and the needed lapping compound, brushes, wire brush, and grease to prepare your input shafts for the new discs. Because there's so much surface area of engagement with the multi-disc clutches, you need to make sure that your input shaft is clean, smooth, and well lubricated so the discs can float during operation. If the discs stick on the input shaft, then the clutch will not want to shift, because when you release the clutch, the disc won't float freely on the input shaft, and that'll cause it to push the friction surface against its accompanying disc or the flywheel or the pressure plate. So you want to make sure that the input shaft is really clean and greased, and you've gone through that procedure. So we'll go through that procedure during this video, but don't overlook that step. It's super critical to the success of this install. The flywheel bolts and the Loctite, pretty self-explanatory. Because the crankshaft bolts are through to the crankcase, I don't think it's a good idea for you to be using solvent and blasting those holes out unless they're oily. If they're real oily, you can use a Q-tip. Put some Q-tip, some brake clean on a Q-tip, and kind of swab the flywheel bolt holes out to get them clean before you reinstall. But don't go blasting a bunch of trash that's in the threads into the engine. That's not a good idea. So we'll get to that step also. In the old days, you had to use a very, very abrasive clutch that was terrible to drive on the street to manage a lot of power. And with the carbons and some of the other segmented disc clutches, you can get multi-plate clutches that drive really well on the street. So this is kind of one of my go-to favorites because it just drives really nice. You can put anybody in the car. Like when you get out of your car at a restaurant and the valet guy gets in, you know that he's not going to just shut the engine off because the clutch is super aggressive, and he can just drive the car around the parking lot like a normal person. So that kind of has a value to me. And also, if I share the car with other people, I don't have to go through some long sequence of how you drive the car. It just drives like a normal car. So that's attractive to me also. If you need to make the clutch able to handle more power, you can add discs, or you can add pressure plate, and or change the friction surface material. So if you get into a single disc that has a very aggressive friction material and a lot of clamp load, you'll get into scenarios where you have a crank walk because it's killed the thrust bearing. Because when you push the clutch down with your foot, the force it takes to overcome that pressure plate is felt by the thrust bearing of the engine. And as soon as the force displaces the oil that's lubricating the thrust bearing will wear, and then you have crank walk. So one of the main advantages to a multi-plate clutch is being able to hold a lot of power without having to worry about crank walk. You'll also notice that this clutch is painted for alignment, so all these parts have to go together in the same order they came apart, and they're numbered. But if you mix this stuff up, the clutch will not work right. These clutches are small production run, hand-built stuff, and they're checked thoroughly before they leave RPS. They check the operation of the clutch, and that means that if you install the clutch correctly, you will have an awesome working clutch right out of the box. This is not a part that they're making 1,000 of a day, and you may get lucky and get the one bad one. These are hand-built components that are built to a high tolerance. It's important that you don't use your greasy fingers and touch the carbon. Try not to touch the carbon at all. just touch the hubs of the discs. And again, they're in order. So 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 as you count down to the flywheel. When you go to put this on your crankshaft, you want to make sure that there's nothing on the back. You don't want to lodge anything. You'll notice that the hole that locates around the crank pilot is chamfered, so you still want to install the flywheel evenly onto the crankshaft, but there's not really a sharp edge for you to worry about getting caught and cutting off a sliver of metal. So part of getting this input shaft prepared for the new clutch is cleaning it. So RPS supplies you with a small wire brush, and first I'm going to just clean all the heavy gunk out of the splines of the input shaft, and then I'll move to the lapping compound and a disc, and I'll just kind of scrub the input shaft clean with the lapping compound. You want to try to remove, basically if you had any small burrs on the input shaft, what they're going to do is they're going to keep the discs from floating when the clutch pedal is depressed, and if the discs don't float well, the clutch won't shift well. So you just want to make sure this is all really clean. It's very, very important that this is done properly. It takes a little bit of time. Just set some time aside to do this and make sure that you clean it really well before you're done and apply the grease, because we did have a guy a while back lap the clutch discs with a lapping compound, and then he installed his transmission with the lapping compound still on the splines, and it ruined the clutch and the input shaft. So you want to make sure that you remove all that lapping compound when you're done, because you don't want any of it left behind. It will make a total mess of your parts. So I'm going to get the lapping compound and one of the supplied brushes. One brush is going to be for the lapping compound, the other one's going to be for the grease. Don't risk cross-contamination with the brushes. So I'm going to take the lapping compound and I'm going to paint the splines on the input shaft. And what this is just, it's kind of like liquid sandpaper. So as you work the input shaft with the discs, you will smooth out any small burrs and things that have happened due to service. Assuming that you've got a transmission that's used, this is just something that happens with wear, because remember, your old clutch was not riding on as much surface area of the input shaft. It was, if you had an old single disc, it was just riding on one piece, and now that you're going to have this multi-disc, there's a lot more surface area covered on the input shaft, and you want to make sure it's all smooth. Basically what you're going to do is you're going to take this, put it on here, and slide it. I don't necessarily need to apply more lapping compound, but it does help if you stop and spread it back around, because the areas that it's being displaced from are going to be the areas that it needs to do the most amount of work. See these little light and dark marks? You can feel that with your fingernail. Back here is real smooth, but through here it still has some more chatter that needs to be cleaned off. So I've not cleaned the lapping compound out of the disc yet, but I have cleaned the first round of lapping compound off the input shaft, and I've grabbed another disc to see how it feels on the input shaft. So right now the input shaft is pretty clean, and I just have a disc that has not been on the transmission yet. As you could guess, the drive side, the side that sees the force of the horsepower turning the input shaft, that's the side that has the most amount of wear. In this particular case, I can kind of see it with my eyes and I can feel it with my fingernail. And what you're trying to do is to lower the high spots, because that's what's going to cause the disc to bind. So we're going to have to do some more lapping on it to try to get that done. But it's only on one side of the input shaft that I have that witness mark from operation. So we're going to clean it a little bit more. This is a 15 to 20 minute ordeal to get this part right. So be patient with it, keep checking, keep doing it until it gets smooth. And when you look at the input shaft or feel the input shaft with your fingernail, it's smooth. So I'm about halfway done. Now on the drive side of the input shaft spline, where it had little high spots and low spots of wear, it's almost smoothed out. So I'm going to go a little bit more. The back half of the input shaft is completely smooth now. So I have a little bit more to do, and then the input shaft will be ready. This is probably the second hardest part of this install because it's kind of tedious and feels like nonsense work. But if you do this correctly, you'll be paid large dividends with the smooth operation of the clutch. The most risky thing during this install is when you put the transmission back in, because it's possible to bend or damage a disc, but we're going to go through that together as we're doing those steps. But don't take this lightly. It's worth your time. It's worth your investment of time to get this right. Now that we're close to finish, we're going to repeat this process with each disc to make sure that none of the new discs have any burrs on their edges where the splines are cut. See how the high spots are going off the input shaft now. because I've got the lapping compound in the splines of the disc, I need to clean that out. Again, that's like liquid sandpaper. You can't leave any of that behind. It's critically important that you get it cleaned out. So I'll just blast down the splines with solvent and just kind of rinse it out. Because the hubs are a bronze color, it's easy to see the black lapping compound on them. So after you clean it off, you can just kind of inspect it and make sure that you've got it all. You don't want any of that left behind. So you're going to do that to all 3 discs carefully. If it's really sloppy, like the first disc we used, you can just use a Q-tip and swab the majority of the lapping compound off. If you're nervous about, you know, getting the solvent everywhere, you can just kind of wipe the bulk of it out. This one's pretty messy because it's the one that we used for the majority of the lapping. Okay, now that that's done, I'm going to wash my hands because I've got some stuff on my hands that I don't want to carry through the rest of the job. So we're now done with the lapping compound. We can put it away. We can put the brush with the lapping compound with it so it does not get mixed up with our clean brush that we're going to use for grease. And I'll be back. So if you notice that the bearing retainer or sleeve that the release bearing slides on was off during that procedure, it's because you're going to be blowing air and lapping compound and stuff around. So I just take it off so I don't put crud in there and not be able to clean it out. So now that it's clean, I can put the bearing retainer back on. So the release bearing comes installed in the pressure plate, but you need to install the pull sleeve into the release bearing. So there's a cone spring, or this is basically a cone washer. It is in fact a spring, and then a plate washer. And then the pressure plate goes on because this is a pull type clutch, and then it's retained with this snap ring. Because the cone spring has energy, you're going to have to push down on the release bearing as you seat the snap ring. You can hear when I push down on the release bearing with one hand and I push down on the spring with the other, the snap ring, and it snaps into place. If you mess this up, it'll be a really short-lived deal because you're going to push the clutch once and the sleeve is going to pull out of the release bearing. So look at that very closely. And all 3 of those parts are available new through Toyota. I just recommend replacing them with your new clutch, because if you have a worn cone spring that's been, you know, heat cycled a million times because it's 20 years old, it's not going to have the same tension, and you're going to be more prone to failure in that part of the clutch. So that's done. So this is going to get lubricated to slide on the collar, but
but for now we're going to install the flywheel, and we can come back and put the clutch stack together and get the transmission in the car. Like I said before, the threads that hold the flywheel to the crankshaft are through to the crankcase, so you don't want to just go blasting the old Loctite into the engine. So I just use a Q-tip. I fish the Q-tip to the end and kind of bottom it out, and then I work it around in a counterclockwise motion, and that wipes what's in the threads out of the engine. If it's really oily, it may take some more time to get clean, but it's better than pushing a bunch of stuff into the engine. It's also a good time to inspect the flywheel holes. If the flywheel has ever come loose on an engine, you know, you'll have some damaged threads and you'll want to work through. If you are going to use a tap to try to straighten out any damaged threads, be sure that it's a chase tap, not a cutting tap, because you don't want to remove material from any of these threads. This area is critical to holding the flywheel on. And then you can kind of just chase it around with your finger to make sure that there's no burrs or high points from a damaged thread that's protruding from the mating surface that would cause the flywheel to not sit flush on the crankshaft. So next we're going to pop that old pilot bearing out, install the new pilot bearing. It will be time to bolt on the flywheel. Make sure after you install your new pilot bearing, you spin it. Make sure it's smooth. If you try to install the bearing and you've cocked it, then you've hammered it straight, it can bend internally and then it won't roll smooth. If this doesn't roll smooth, you will not have a proper working clutch, because you'll disengage the clutch and this will still be rotating the transmission because it's damaged. So this should turn nice and smooth. This flywheel fits right on the crankshaft without any force. It's tight, there's no play. If your flywheel is tight on your crankshaft, you can warm the flywheel up on a hot plate just to like 110 degrees, and it will grow enough to slide over this locating ring on the crank. RPS gives you Loctite to put on the flywheel bolts. Just make sure that you install the flywheel bolts with the red Loctite supplied. I torqued the flywheel to 65 foot-pounds with the Loctite, and I'll use a pry bar and this mounting bolt to just hold the engine still while I torque the flywheel. There's 8 bolts. I suggest counting in your head as you do them, or count out loud. You don't want to miss a bolt, because the flywheel will fall off and it will be a pretty damaging experience. So the flywheel is tight. If you want, you can put a born-on date on it. That way you know when you go back into the car what month you'd installed it. And now we can move back to the transmission. We're going to get the pressure plate and discs loaded onto the transmission, and then we can come back over and put the transmission back in the car. So we're going to use our clean, small paintbrush and put the grease on the splines of the input shaft. This will help the discs float and not bind. If you've ever had a car that was kind of sticky to go into gear with the engine running, and you let off the clutch and push the clutch back in and then it goes right back into gear, it's more than likely that the disc is hanging on the input shaft. Because this is a new collar, it's dry. If you're reusing your old collar, I would just recommend cleaning it out. And there's a basically a grease reservoir in it all the way around. You can just put the excess grease in that reservoir, and it will come into play as needed over time. Because I've got grease on my fingers, I'm going to wash my hands again because I don't want to risk getting grease on the clutch discs. Take this opportunity to look at this spring, snap ring that holds the collar into the release bearing, and make sure that it's back closed and that this is all the way installed. If this is not all the way installed, you're going to have a rough ending to your clutch install. So you can kind of, just like we did when we installed it, push down on this, and you can feel the movement in the spring. That movement is in the spring, and then you can just push on this bearing. If you want, you can tap on this, but you want to make sure that it's seated all the way around, or it's not going to work out good for you. I'm going to put the pressure plate on the collar, slide it all the way back. And now we can start to load the discs again in order. This is part number 7. So we're going to go 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 B in the flywheel. The orange again is going to be lined up. So when you load all this into the flywheel, it's going to be in order. So you want to put your orange painted marks together right now. The discs obviously don't matter. You can put it here, you can put it here, you can put it here. There's no alignment on the disc. So if there's a part of a triple install that's tricky, you're going to put this stuff in the car, and you're going to have to work the flywheel into these loose floaters as you install the transmission. And if you're doing it on your back, or you're doing it without a transmission jack, it's not a very easy job. This really should be done on a lift with a transmission jack, so you have finite control of the transmission. Because if you're doing this on your back and you get frustrated and you start jamming the transmission into the flywheel, it's more than likely you're going to bend one of these tabs. And once you bend one of these, your clutch is never going to be the same again. And you've damaged it during install. So it's best to have a jack and a lift to properly control the mass of the transmission. And under no circumstance with any clutch install should you ever, just because you got a bolt started in the transmission, don't try to pull the transmission into the engine or onto the engine, because there's a bind and you need to figure out why there's a bind. This whole assembly should slide right up to the mating surface of the block every time on any clutch install. So I'm going to put the transmission up in the car. I'm going to have my hand around this area, because if I tilt the transmission with the tail up, one of these discs can slide off and hit the ground, and that's not what you want to do. Before you put it up near the car, I would say look at where the flywheel is and put your orange marks in similar orientation. So once you get it up in the car, it's not very hard for you to get it all mated. So my orange marks on my flywheel are gonna be at 6 o'clock, and I've got all this stuff down here at 6 o'clock, so it'll be pretty straightforward to get it installed. As I get close to where the transmission and clutch is starting to make contact with the flywheel, I'm just going to check alignment again to make sure that all that stuff's lined up. And I'm going to use my fingertips, more or less, to pull the transmission forward gently. This is by far the most tedious part of this install. And I know that the parts are heavy, but did you see that movement? All I did with my fingertips is I'll move it back out so you can see it, but here's the transmission not moving forward, okay? And then I take my fingertips, just my thumbs, and I move the floater to where it can get into the flywheel. And when I do that, the whole assembly is able to go forward more. So now this one is in, and now I've got this one floating, and I'll put it in as I get there. But my flywheel has moved, so I have to rotate the flywheel back to get in position to receive this floater. So, but we're really close to the engine now, so we don't have much more to go. So right now, the pressure plate is still free. I can move it with my fingertip. The second floater, or the back floater, is still free. I can move it with my fingertip, but it's not really in alignment. So nothing's bound, everything is still free. I need to get the transmission closer to the engine, and then I can go ahead and seat the rest of this stack together. But I guess the biggest thing that you have is they both kind of happen simultaneously. So right there, with one thumb on this floater and the other thumb on this floater and my fingertips on the pressure plate, I just push it all forward, and now my floaters are engaged in the flywheel. The pressure plate is not jammed up at all. It's still free floating. So I can go ahead and bolt the transmission to the engine now. Without the use of a ratchet to pull, I've just installed the bell housing to engine block bolts by hand, just with my fingertips. The floaters, I can both, I can wiggle them with my fingertips. If you can hear that, they're just rattling free. And my pressure plate is aligned with the flywheel. So now I can go ahead and finish bolting the engine back to the transmission. If you don't do this often, I recommend definitely not using air tools and just doing the stuff by hand and checking the pressure plate as you tighten it down to ensure that if you've got the transmission really crooked right now, it'll have an air gap on the top and no air gap on the bottom because the transmission is hanging off the engine. And you just want to make sure that you take that up with care. You don't want to, you cannot jam the transmission back into the car. It will screw something up for sure. Right now the transmission is just hand tight with a small ratchet, but it's totally seated against the engine block. The pressure plate is still free and these floaters are still free. So now you can make sure your pressure plate is in alignment and slide it forward. to where it's on the dowels, and from there you can start bolting it on. But it's important that you check this floater and make sure that your floater isn't bound as you install the flywheel bolts, because if it's bound, you still can bend the floater. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to tighten the transmission to the engine, because I'm not going to want to come back to that afterwards. So let me get that out of the way, and then we'll tighten the pressure plate to the flywheel. I'm just moving the engine so I can access the hardware. So I'm going to use a ratchet and just on the snout of the crankshaft, and rotate the engine as needed to access the flywheel bolt or the pressure plate bolts. So your floater is free, you can move that, and you need to bring the pressure plate up to the flywheel now. So you should be able to, with your thumbs, squeeze it up till you have about a, it looks like about a 5mm gap. And then you can start a pressure plate bolt. So if you look over here, 5mm gap, come over here, 5mm gap. You know that the pressure plate is not cocked and it's free. It's just laying on the dowels, and now it's time to install some hardware. So these bolts use the supplied blue Loctite, and I'll just spin it in with my fingertips, and I'll turn the engine while feeling the other window. And when another bolt hole arrives, I'll come over here. I'll turn this one in by hand. Turn the engine a little bit more. Another bolt hole shows up. There are 6 of them. Okay, now I've got all 6 bolts started. I'm going to use this little small ratchet and run them in a little bit. Okay, now I'm back to the painted bolt where they left us this orange alignment paint. That's where I'll start torquing, because with my small ratchet I've got them all seated. So the painted bolts kind of give me a good point of reference. All right. So I go to 26 foot-pounds on these. So I have to hold the engine still with one hand and tighten the bolts with the other. And because you can't see all these bolts, I recommend marking them as you go. That way you know that you've tightened them all. Again, you know, missing a piece of hardware with an assembly like this is a pretty bad deal. You find your way back to the first bolt you painted. You know that you've got all 6, and you can start to install the remainder of the hardware involved. So you have 2 bolts to go through to the lower pan, 2 bolts to go through the lower pan into the transmission case. The factory cars house a ground down here on this lower bolt, so be sure to put that back on. So I'm going to put the fork in real quick and just actuate the clutch by hand. That way I know without any hydraulics the clutch operates as it should. So the rest of this install is just, you know, drive shaft, shifter, exhaust, the normal Supra transmission install. But before I get to that step, I just like to do a little reality check. So here is the transmission in neutral. I'll put the transmission in gear. Now it's in gear. And I'll take a pry bar and I'm going to actuate the clutch by hand. Because that's going to give me kind of a go, no go on whether or not the clutch is opening. So I've opened the clutch by hand and now I can rotate it, and as I start to close the clutch, I can create drag. You can hear it dragging. Now it's sticky and now the clutch is released. Clutch is open, transmission spins freely. So that's how it should actuate. That's how you know that it's okay to do the rest of the install, because if you have messed something up to this point and you put your drive shaft and shifter and exhaust and wash your hands and reconnect your battery and install the starter motor and you're already excited to go and you depress the clutch and the clutch won't open, the clutch won't disengage, you're pushing the pedal down and it will not go into gear, you've missed something. And if you check this step here, you know that when you get to that step, you've got a hydraulic problem and not a mechanical problem. So just a quick and easy reality check for you. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up, get the rest of the stuff on the car, and then we can just do a quick test drive in it and get it back to the customer.